Who's the president that promised to only serve one term in office, yet in those first 4 years, he accomplished all of his campaign promises by working tirelessly to meet the needs of the American people, like a true America First president. In this video, I will discuss with you exactly what made this man America's most consequential single-term president in our history. The 11th president, James Knox Polk, or JKP, is one of my favorites because he promised and followed through with those promises to complete his agenda. Polk was often referred to as Young Hickory or Little Jackson because his leadership style echoed that of Jackson. But before we go further, if you've been enjoying my U.S. presidential history content recently, please consider subscribing to the channel down below to join our community of U.S. history lovers. And if you've already done so, thank you. Now let's get into it. Let's first understand Polk's leadership style and how he developed the character arc that was so influential to his presidency. Polk always looked up to the 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Polk and Jackson were both Democrats who cared deeply about the nation's economy and growth, but often put that above the lives of innocent citizens in different ways. For example, Polk declared war on Britain over control of the Oregon Territory. Polk and his forces won that war, expanding the country's geography, but as a result of the expansion, many Americans and Brits were killed. Furthermore, many Americans strongly disliked Polk because he was very partisan and rarely heard advice from those with opposing political views, which was unattractive to the Whig Party. Young Hickory earned that nickname due to his toughness and work ethic, and the way that he idolized Jackson, who is known as Old Hickory. Speaking of that toughness and work ethic, most historians would agree that Polk was a hard worker. He reduced sleep to increase time on the job. He worked late nights and early mornings to meet the needs of the American people. His intense work habits gave him the reputation of the most consequential single-term president in American history. Right, now to his campaign for the White House. Going into the 1844 Democratic National Convention, the party was unsure on who to nominate for president. Remember, at that time, delegates voted at the convention to decide a nominee. Primaries and caucuses were far less prominent in the 19th century compared to now. At the start of the convention, Polk was unheard of to many delegates, but by the end of it, he was their guy. Democrats nominated Polk, and he ran a campaign with 5 core promises. First, he wanted to cut tariffs to ease tensions between the North and South leading up to the Civil War. Second, he wanted to recreate an independent U.S. Treasury to stabilize the country's economy. Third, he wanted to claim the Oregon Territory from Britain to expand the nation's geography. Fourth, he wanted to add California and New Mexico to the United States for the same reason. Finally, he promised to retire after one term in office. Polk established an independent treasury to handle the country's most important financial decisions. Before this, the government kept its money in private banks, which often caused issues resulting in Americans facing frequent economic recessions. Polk believed the government should control its own money without relying on private banks. In 1846, JKP signed a law that created an independent treasury system. This system allowed the government to store money in its own vaults instead of private banks, thus growing the economy. It also made sure that government payments were made in gold and silver, which helped stabilize the American finances. The independent treasury gave the government more control over its financial resources and reduced the risk of bank failures, affecting national funds for all Americans. Even though some people opposed it, the system lasted for many years. Polk's decisions strengthened the U.S. economy and made the government less dependent on banks. His work on the independent treasury was one of his key accomplishments as president. But Polk's most significant achievement in office was expanding the country's footprint. He offered Britain a deal to evenly divide the Oregon Territory at the 49th parallel, which included present-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Britain declined and insisted that the border be along the Columbia River, which would give Britain more territory than the United States. Therefore, the land between the 49th parallel and the Columbia River in the Oregon Territory was disputed, so Congress approved Polk declaring war on Britain to maximize United States control over the Oregon Territory. Polk was not done yet. He also wanted land from Mexico, including California and New Mexico. When Mexico refused to sell the land, a war broke out between two countries in 1846. After the U.S. won the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848. This treaty gave the United States California, New Mexico, and several other western states. Many Americans supported Polk's actions because they believed in manifest destiny, the idea that the country should stretch from Atlantic to Pacific. However, some people disagreed with the war and thought it was unfair to Mexico. In the end, Polk's presidency added great amounts of land to the country, shaping the future for the United States to continue expanding. There's no denying that Polk was quite successful in expanding the nation's territory, cutting tariffs, and establishing an independent treasury. But the way he did it with extreme violence and a hot temperament made him a divisive president today. In spite of his numerous successes, he stuck to his most core promise. He voluntarily stepped down from the presidency in 1849. Polk was looking forward to retirement for most of his presidency. When he did retire, he took a tour across the country. Tragically, on that tour, he contracted cholera. an infection contracted from eating contaminated food or drinking contaminated water. You remember another president that died from drinking contaminated water, don't you? You don't? That must mean you didn't watch my William Henry Harrison video, which I think you should be watching soon. Right? Got me? Okay. Anyway, now that you're back from that video, Polk died 3 months after leaving office, after suffering from weeks of cholera. 3 of the 4 presidents from 1841 to 1850 died from diseases contracted by drinking DC water. But the one president in that era who survived drinking the DC water is known as His Excellency. Where did he get that name from? Click here to find out.